Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on mitigating risk with digital experimentation. Thank you very much for everybody who's joined us. We're going to be looking at how experimentation can enable you to balance risk and reward by testing bigger and bolder changes to help you grow your business while de-risking new designs, messaging, and different features. And we're really pleased to be joined today by Chris Gibbins, the Chief Experiment Officer with Creative CX, as well as Liz Robertson, our lead product marketer from A/B Tasty. Both Liz and Chris have lots of knowledge when it comes to digital experiences, experimentation, UX testing, and as we go through the webinar, we're going to touch on a lot of those topics as well. Before we kind of begin for real, just a few kind of housekeeping rules about how the webinar works. So everybody that's here can probably see that we have like a chat section where if you want to give any comments, you want to ask any questions or anything like that, you can do there. But if you really want to ask a question so that we can kind of pose it to both Liz and Chris at the end, there is a question section which you can tap on, and you can leave all your questions there. What we're going to try and do is kind of go through the different storyline that Liz and Chris have got for us and the different points that they're going to talk about. Ask questions as we go along, and we're going to try and take all those questions as we hit the end. Chris, shall I let you begin?
Absolutely, yeah. So really excited to be here and talk to you guys. So I'm Chris, I'm Chief Experience Officer at Creative CX, and we're an experimentation consultancy. And then Liz, do you want to introduce yourself before I go on? Or?
Yep, sure. So I'm Liz, and I work at A/B Tasty, as John said, in product marketing. And so we are an experience optimization platform.
Great. So I thought I'd just show a little bit about us, really. I'm not going to talk too much, but you'll get the slides later anyway. So basically, we're an experimentation consultancy based in London, working with a whole lot of different clients from around the world. And the three things we do are we work really hard on understanding our customers and the products and services through a lot of research and UX research, as well as more innovation research. And the main bit is we do a lot of experimentation with all kinds of different sectors, with the aim of optimizing, personalizing, and innovating our clients' digital products and services. And actually, the third thing is for scaling. So we're doing a lot more of this last year especially, which is scaling experimentation capability across their organizations, because people have, I think people are starting to get it now and starting to get that experimentation is crucial to the business. But it's not always easy when you start to scale it across all your product teams, for example. And that's where we come in. So that's a little bit about us.
And for A/B Tasty, so we're helping marketers, CRO specialists, and product managers from over 1,000 brands use our experimentation and feature management solutions to create the best experiences. So a little fun fact about us is that we have exposed experimentation and personalization campaigns to over 70 billion visits. We serve global brands and have offices around the world. We work with brands across various industries, from retail, finance, to publishing, automotive, and B2B. So Chris, if you'll go to the next slide, you can see some of our customers. We're looking at Walmart, Eurosport, Sephora, to name a couple. If I'm going to continue to boast, we're also the leader of the Forrester Wave on experimentation and feature management. I don't normally cover this slide until the end, but I thought it was pretty pertinent to the webinar today. It's our tagline, which is let your good ideas take flight. It's let your good ideas take flight. You know, it's not your bad ones, not your just okay ones, but the ones that really make a difference. So to be honest, a lot of tests run by our customers show negative to no uplift or very little uplift. And I'm sorry to say, but that's because not all of your ideas, you're well thought. I know you take a lot of time to think about them and to innovate, but not all of them are worth going into a full development cycle and exposing to your customers. And you know what? It's okay. Everyone fails. It's really not your fault. It's extremely difficult to keep up with customer experience. It's constantly changing. And that's why we're here today, because we're going to talk about how do you manage that risk when you're trying to meet these expectations that are, constantly on the move, and especially with the competition that are changing just as quickly as you are. Risk has become, an everyday part of our work lives as we move faster to meet these customer expectations. It is impossible to innovate without taking risks. It's impossible to outpace the competition without taking risks. And that's because a lot of industries, so retail, travel, hospitality, finance, you have that one misstep in experience. It means that someone else is going to take 30 seconds to look for a similar product on a similar site that isn't yours. I know I've done it myself. And this type of movement with customers has really led to unparalleled demand and unparalleled pressure on marketing, product, and engineering teams to make fast decisions and implement new features while delivering with minimal risk and high ROI, which realistically isn't easy and pretty much impossible. So one of the best ways for teams to make informed, low-risk, data-driven decisions, and more importantly, decisions that really come directly from your customer, is through experimentation. Experimentation is really going to demonstrate what works and what doesn't work, and it's going to be based on real data. So despite all the risks that come with innovating, we can see that a lot of successful organizations are continuing to do it. Gartner has shown that successful organizations prioritize experimentation 2 times more. So that means that they're testing all the devices, all the channels, they're experimenting everything, everywhere. We know also that whoever is closest to the customer wins. Makes sense. By making a customer feedback loop and continually iterating based on what you learn, you can ensure your product is always the best option on the market. And brands that do win, they're not scared. They aren't scared to release new features and products. Companies that everyone names, Amazon, Google, and Netflix, they deploy thousands of times per day. We actually did the calculation, and that's about 4 deployments per day over 365 days. It's impressive and it sounds scary, but we're going to talk today a little bit more about how do you mitigate those risks. And I'm going to leave it with Chris to go into detail on that.
And I think one really important point as a follow-on from your about helping you make better decisions. One of the key things of experimentation is it's so much more than just optimization, just the remit of, say, an optimization team or CRO team working in a kind of a silo, which is often the way you get going with experimentation. But there's so much more potential to be realized if you start to expand out to all your product teams, if you start to almost experiment by default. And that's kind of our role, really, is to help people to do that. But I think it's worth talking about and actually pointing out. But it's not always that easy to do either. It's actually, sometimes when it's experimentation is hard to get right, and it's sometimes easier to do in a small team because you have complete control. But the way to get the numbers that Liz was talking about before is that it has to go out around the whole business, and you have to start thinking about what percentage of customer and business decisions do we make based on an experiment, a controlled randomized experiment, which is so important. So today we're talking about the mitigating risks, as we mentioned, and actually to create a bit of structure, really, we're going to talk about 5 risks that experimentation can help mitigate. First one is about about harmful changes and the risk to the customer and the business. Second one is the financial risk. Third is competitive risk, and then we got the learning risk, which is interesting, and we'll end on the growth risk, which is probably the most exciting. We all want to grow our organizations. So the first one is all about harmful changes. And I thought I would start with an interesting piece of data from the Experimentation Works book by Stefan Tomk. And what he did in this book, well, it's a great book, definitely worth reading. One of the things was he benchmarked a load of experiments, around 21,000 experiments, in fact, to see how many were successful. And he found out around 10% of all experiments resulted in a statistically significant positive result on the primary metric. 10% is not a lot, is it? So if you think about all those experiments that people do, actually, only 10% are proven to be better than the current control, which again just emphasizes how hard it is to get it right. The other data, interestingly, was around 10% also were negative. And I think this is really key for the risk of releasing harmful changes. So it doesn't matter despite all your best intentions and all the work and the design and the understanding of the problem that you're solving, everything that goes into an idea, you still only have still 80% don't do anything, and 10% even harm the experience. So it just highlights, just imagine not experimenting, not just releasing things which are obvious, a hell of a lot of them won't work, and a lot of them will harm the experience, and that's the risk here.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. These are the numbers to back up exactly what you said, Chris. There are those who experiment, there are those who aren't, but either way, 25 to 45% of new products fail, which means that all the investments that have gone into these products, that's development investments, marketing investments, et cetera, they're not activating the right KPIs, or at least the objective KPIs, and they aren't showing return on investment. And 1 in 5 products fail to meet customer needs, meaning that they're not solving the problem that teams have worked so hard to solve in the first place. And worse, they're disappointing their customers and they're hurting customer experience.
And I think it's because customers are pretty hard to predict, aren't they, Liz? So it's really difficult to get it right first time.
Yeah, definitely.
So this is actually a story from working with another client, and this is actually from this is really interesting because this is the whole thing around no-brainers. You've probably heard it mentioned quite a lot of the time that people have this no-brainer that we don't even need to test it. Everybody knows that and this is on a product listings page on a fashion retailer, one of our clients, massive international client of ours. And even though one of these, like the variation, the load more approach, seems so obvious to everybody, or the product team, everybody just wanted to go ahead with this because you don't need to test it. It's going to win, isn't it? It's a load more. Everybody knows that. And we all know that the old school pagination on the left is a bit fiddly. And actually, when we did our usability testing earlier on, we did find that the one on the left was fiddly. It definitely needs to be improved. But luckily, and we work for the Center of Excellence, which we helped set up for this company in experimentation. Luckily, we managed to just save this, get there in time to actually make sure we test it as an A/B test and convince them not to just roll it out across all their markets, across all their brands. And I'm really glad we did, because actually it ended up in a -5% on conversion rate for this so-called no-brainer. And it just showed what harm they could be doing to everybody if they just rolled it out. And it would have lost millions and millions of pounds if they'd just gone ahead with this. The other crazy thing is, I think when you roll out something, they may not be aware that they're losing millions and millions of pounds if it wasn't via an experiment. It just shows the importance of server-side experimentation too, of embedding this process into the normal product development at a huge organization.
Yeah, I mean, I would have definitely chosen that second option. I showed that slide to a couple of people too, being like, who else would fall in that trap? And we were many. But in terms of, that brand is a, well, we can't talk about it, but I would want to talk a couple of minutes about a very public brand now. So I think if you can go to the next slide, Chris. So, I don't think Facebook is ever going to live this down, mainly because people like me from Feature Management Solutions keep quoting the problems and the rollouts and bad rollouts that they're doing. I'm sorry, Facebook. But a couple of years ago, Facebook, they're a massive company, a lot of money, a lot of resources. They very publicly struggled with a small change. So this was back in 2022. They had a small change that was pushed into production. It broke their authentication method. And, it's not just authenticating into Facebook. It's the fact that, I think everyone in this room, or most people, have Facebook as single sign-on for their apps or for their websites. And if you break the authentication, you break the authentication for all of those apps as well. So they're a big company. They obviously recovered from it. They have other issues, but not related to this. But I think it's a good reminder that brand loyalty is fickle, and one bad experience for a lot of brands might be all it takes. And so it's really important to be able to manage this process and manage the risk that's associated with releasing new features. So ideally, it would be great to solve things with a little magic button. or in other words, a kill switch, because part of mitigating business risk is managing your features. So in terms of best practices, when you're implementing new features and when you want to minimize business impact, I'd say that there are really two tools at your disposal. So there are feature flags and automatic rollbacks. So feature flags you can build into your own code. You don't need a third-party tool, even if I highly recommend one in order to easily manage the flags. This is something that you can do on your own with your developers. And they're going to allow you to turn on and off features. So when something goes wrong, it's the magic button. You can switch it off before the features have a chance to make an impact on your customers. Or on the other hand, when you're doing experimentation and something goes really well, you can also switch it on for your other customers. So it really gives you that level of control. The other thing about implementing feature flags is that it's going to allow you to decouple your code delivery with releases. So that means that you can, deliver, your devs can deliver their code, but it doesn't mean that you need to expose your customers to these features. And it's really important for managing business risk, right? Because just because the feature is ready, is it really the right time to release it for the market? You might want to wait until all teams feel confident enough to execute experiments and new features at the right time. Is the go-to market ready for that? For example, you might want to release them based on regions, release in a test market first before rolling out to major markets. Another big part of managing risk is managing anxiety and building the confidence to take risks. Being able to automatically roll back the features with your preferred KPIs means that you don't have to constantly be checking your features. Are they working? Are they not working? Is there going to be a huge problem? Can I actually roll out on a Friday and not have to be stressed the entire weekend? If you're rolling out a new feature with a huge impact on the bottom line, a really good example is if you're rolling out a new checkout system, right? If that doesn't work, that means that could be a whole weekend where you're not converting anyone and you're not able to complete those baskets. So attaching a revenue KPI will allow you to roll back to the old system should anything go awry.
And automatically, of course, which is... So the second risk is a financial risk of finding out too late in the day. And this is probably something most of you have been in, a situation you've been in before. And it's all about these, and it's a tricky one. I have a UX background, so I've been involved in loads of projects as well, and they get really big sometimes, the projects. But the key thing is to try to find out as early as possible, at scale, whether the signs look good for it working. So experimenting as early as possible, not waiting until 6 months later. And I've seen a lot of these, especially when we've been working with new clients or just consulting or helping you to audit their programs, where they've almost done everything in the right order. They've done a lot of user research, but they haven't tested the water as such at scale with their users, and therefore they found out too late. And it's a huge risk on the people, all the hours, all the salaries, and if you're using an agency, all those hours which have gone into designing this brand new feature or this brand new part of the website. It's also the time wasted. What else could they have learned and achieved in that time? If they'd found out early that that idea really doesn't have legs. And then the last one is it's actually hugely dissatisfactory, isn't it, for the experience of the team, and quite demoralizing actually, if you put all the effort into something and only you find out at the end. And what can sometimes happen is then everyone works really hard to look for the data, to look for some positive signs, almost looking for excuses to drive it forward, even if it's not working with their customers. So what we always try to do is to try to do some kind of experiment really early on at scale, after the first lot of user research and usability testing, for example. And it takes creativeness when it comes to designing your experiments, but there are several ways that you can do this. One of them is the painted door or fake door test, where, and this is interesting, this is a case study when we're working with Treatwell, the cost of implementing a feature can be really expensive, so we wanted to find out really early on. And on this example, on the control, actually on the original site, we discovered that actually a lot of people would like photos as part of the reviews, that they would like to people to upload photos of their experiences so they could get a better idea of the salons, for example. But to build a feature like this, we wanted to know how many people would actually upload their photos when writing a review. And to build that feature would have cost a lot of money and taken a lot of time. So what we did on the right here is that we did a painted door test where we included this thing where it says share a photo, upload a photo, this little widget here. And when the user clicked that, they got an overlay, which is on the right-hand side, you can see, that says share photos of your treatment. And in the text, it's a bit small, but it says customer photo sharing is not yet available on our mobile website, but we're thinking about adding it. Is this a feature you would like to use? And this gave us invaluable data to help them justify and help them make the decision whether we want to go ahead and develop this. We could, the most important data is the first interaction of how many people upload a photo. And then the second data information around is almost like more of a survey, can just give you added kind of certainty. And it worked for them. It gave them the data they needed to make that business decision. And this test was done very, very simply, a very small test. So this is one extreme you could do really, really early on. And it's not something you launch for a long period of time. It's really just to get it out there for a couple of days to get some feedback, because there is a bit of dissatisfaction in doing so. And then there's many other things that you can make a bit more working, a bit more minimal. So a bit more working, but still not the fully feature or functioning feature. And it's one of the funnest parts about experimentation, is finding out how can we get the answers we need to make the decision or not. And it's a really good example, this one.
Yeah, it's really sneaky and smart at the same time. I'm going to keep an eye out for things like that in the future. I think it's really great. So another way to validate ideas is to test them first on a small audience. So it's a little bit what you were saying, Chris, where you can test it for a small amount of time or just on a small amount of visitors. So a best practice when you're balancing speed and safety is using progressive deployment. So it's progressively rolling out your experiments or any new features. So this will allow you to get vital feedback from your first testers, see how they respond, how do they interact with those features, and validate your feature before you continue rolling out, or before you decide to tweak it, or there might be a point when you decide that you're going to stop investing in that feature because you weren't getting the response you were hoping for opening it up to 10% of your population. So, nowadays, with progressive deployment, with feature flag, there's really this movement where there's no reason to continue to really have these stressful big bang releases anymore. And you can really be progressive and release when you want to release. And so some examples of ways you could do progressive rollouts and progressive deployment is ring deployments. So that's an example where you would go by testing alpha, beta, then early adopters before you go GA. Or you can roll out percentages, what I just said earlier. You can start with 10%. Then when you're more confident, go to 25, 50 before rolling out to all of your visitors. Deploying is also, a support for business functions. I said earlier, you can roll out regionally, but you could roll out also to certain packages. So maybe you want to start rolling out features to the basic package. And then when you're very confident, you can roll it out to the premium package. Or you could do the opposite. Maybe you want to roll out to your MVP customers first and give them first access to a new feature. So there's lots of ways that, you can really validate ideas bit by bit without taking that risk of rolling it out to everyone at once. I want to share a little use case here in terms of managing financial risk, where we're looking at the return on investment of experimentation. And it's not just always in revenue and additional revenue, right? Sometimes it can be about saving money and improving customer experience. So this is an A/B test that's run by a customer of ours, Panasonic, to drive traffic towards self-service customer support. They tested adding a contact us link in the header. So this had a direct impact on reducing call volume, increasing the usage of digital support, and saving $30,000 yearly. So I'm going to pass it back to Chris to go on to the next topic of competition.
So yes, the next risk, which is competitive risk of just following everyone else. And who wants to do that? Who wants to spend their life just a little bit behind everyone else? And I think on this one, I thought I would tell an interesting story around the situation I was in. We were talking to a client, and they were going through a re-platform of their retail website. And what happens often in re-platforms is that people will also, we're re-platforming, let's just redesign the whole thing at the same time, which, you know, we most of us on here will know that that's probably not a good idea, because we'll never really know what caused the uplift or downlift, as so often is the case with complete redesigns. So we're all sat around a table in these discovery meetings, and it got to the point of a checkout, and they were saying, okay, but why don't we think about redoing our checkout? What kind of model should we go for? And then two people got their mobile phones out and said, let's look at John Lewis. So if you're from the UK, you'll know that a lot of people have always looked up to John Lewis as the way to do things, and they do some good stuff, actually. And two separate people from each side of the table said, let's copy let's take inspiration, from the John Lewis checkout. And I can see here that they have a three-step process, don't we? And just at the point when they said that, the other person was saying, yeah, let's do John Lewis. They have an accordion style checkout, don't they? Where it's all on the same page and it's accordion. So basically there are two different approaches. And of course, what they didn't know is that they're A/B testing. So there's always that danger in copying. You don't know what you're copying. You don't know whether you're copying an experiment, a failing variation at all. But the bigger thing also is that you're always going to be that one step behind them. So even if you do happen to copy the better one, they're going to be moving on and do something better than you. So you're always going to be following. And I think there's a real problem in all different sectors. There's a problem of only looking at your main competitors. So therefore, you really struggle to differentiate from them. You end up always being a little bit behind, and probably copying the wrong one sometimes as well. And I bet many of you can relate to that story. So we move on to the next one, which is the learning risk, which is it stems from everything we've talked about so far, to be honest. It's actually comes down to, and it also stems from when Liz was talking about the feedback loop as well. So the first thing is, randomized controlled experiments are the gold standard of causal conclusions. Basically, they're the gold standard of learning whether something works or not. And that's why it's so important, above everything else, every other data point, really. So you need the shortest feedback loops you can get. The painted door type tests allow you to get a shorter feedback loop because you can find out something a bit more quickly. But as long as their conclusions are trustworthy, and that's the key, it's actually so dangerous that you make the wrong conclusion from an experiment or from another testing method, really. And it's really dangerous about that. But we've talked a lot about financial risk and the business risk and customer risk. But actually, there is a learning risk because it affects the team's knowledge. So, or everybody working on something, imagine they draw the wrong conclusions, or they never learn, and they carry on working there, and the whole team forever thinks that a certain type of pagination is the way to go, and it always works and everything. And they could have been bringing it up for years to come, and they would never know any better. That's a huge risk in my mind, which I think people don't always talk about, the learning risk.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the other thing about it is teams need to be confident in what they're doing, right? So they don't need to be too overconfident, which I think is part of the point you were making. But at one point, they need to go forward with their experiment, right? They need to go quickly. They need to have confidence about the results. And so another best practice is to decide which statistical method is best for you. So at A/B Tasty, for our client-side solution and our server-side solution flagship, we've chosen to use the Bayesian statistical model to help you decide with confidence. So, there are lots of different models you can use out there that, will give you different levels and degrees of confidence and different details on what you're looking for. We do, and I'm going to be contentious when I say this, but you can peek at the results during the test. you shouldn't. And someone who's, very, generally people in CRO experts will tell me I shouldn't say this. But, the reality is sometimes you're pushed to act quickly. Sometimes your managers, your C-levels are asking for you to make a decision, and you would rather make a decision on some data than none at all. Ideally, you would take the 2 weeks and make sure you have enough visitors seeing that experimentation. But sometimes it's also good to have a little peek and see, can you decide if there's already a clear winner or if it needs more time? The second recommendation, and it's really important, is to look at the return on investment. So here, it's not to look at the revenue, because it's not about being a winner, right? It's not because an idea is a winner that it means that it's worth the investment. By how much more is this test winning, and is that enough to justify the investment that your product and engineering teams are going to make, that your marketing teams are going to make for go-to-market? Is it enough to justify that winning experiment and move ahead with building that feature? I would say that the third recommendation is defining a confidence level that works for you. So if you have a very high stakes campaign, you might want to set a confidence interval that's a little bit higher to make sure that, when you make that decision, you've given yourself a little bit more chance in deciding which campaign is really the winning one. So you want that confidence level before moving forward with a decision. So again, if it's really high stakes, you might want to give yourself a little bit bigger of an interval.
I think one of the things on here is interesting, because sometimes the reality is, like you say, even if you want to wait 2 weeks or whatever we said as the duration, based on the sample size, etc. In a business situation, sometimes there's a variation that is underperforming, and the reality is sometimes you do need to turn off that variation after, say, a week. It's just one of those.
Yeah.
It's one of those things. You can be purist and say, no, we have to wait until the end, but actually, it's still reality, isn't it? So anything that can make our lives easier in that extent is brilliant.
Yeah, definitely, 100%. And beyond just running the tests, it's about managing the different teams involved. And I think this goes back to the learning. If there's the number one recommendation when it comes to team development that I would make is building a culture of experimentation. So Chris, if you can move to the next slide, please. Oh, great. Thank you. Chris mentioned this earlier when he was talking about his agency. It's gone from just creating A/B tests to working with scaling experimentation. And he was telling me when we were rehearsing earlier that the work is really rarely around building these experiments now, but also getting everyone on board with the experimentation. And, in the attendee list, I had to look at it, I had to peek at it before this webinar started, and I saw that, there are marketers, product managers, CRO specialists. You've all got your parts to play when it comes to implementing experimentation, whether that's optimization or whether that's innovation. And, even though there's 3 teams up here on the slide, the risk that can happen and the risks that occur involve a lot of other teams. So, customer service teams, for example, are the ones who are often bearing the brunt of future rollouts gone wrong. How much time are they spending answering complaints? A good experiment comes with well-defined shared goals across departments, shared metrics with all stakeholders concerned. And so on top of that, you're going to obviously need the data to test a CRR solution, personalization and feature management solutions that are going to get you there. So whether you're looking to improve, adapt, anticipate, or innovate, your company needs to know the hypothesis, know the audience, and know when you've reached success, and share that success within the company. And we had our user conference on Monday, so 2 days ago already. And that was the big thing that came out of it, is often, it's winning other teams over and it's bringing other teams on board. That's really important because you need to get that culture of experimentation throughout the company. And it's not always easy.
No, that's sometimes the challenge, is trying to sell the idea to them, actually explain and present experimentation in a way that resonates with different people, say in product teams who aren't normally used to it. I think that's really important too, that the way that you sell the idea to a designer, the way you talk about experimentation, we find needs to be a bit different depending on the role.
100%, yeah.
And our last risk we want to talk about is the growth risk of playing it too safe. And I think one of the most fun parts about experimentation is, and about the culture too, it's encouraging people to ideate in a different way, encourage them to push themselves, because they now have the safety net that is experimentation. It's actually the, I remember years and years ago, people used to think experimentation and designing with data as such was a bit boring. It's like it restricts them. Oh no, now I've got the data telling me what I can and can't do. But actually it's complete reverse, isn't it? If you, experimentation and mitigating risk through experimentation is effectively equal to creative freedom. It gives you more freedom to try things out. So the first thing about playing it too safe, and I think this is about how adventurous are you being in your ideas? Is the experiment at the end of a day just a tick box exercise? Is it just validating a final idea, yes or no? That's why I always ask a question, how many of you are still just doing A/B testing? And what I mean is just one variation as opposed to ABN testing. That can sometimes be a clue as to whether you're being adventurous enough. And I know there are difficulties sometimes depending on the volume of traffic, but whenever possible, if you can kind of start to stretch to do ABN, multiple variations in your A/B tests, it gives you more room for pushing yourselves a bit further. So after all, there's more than one way to solve a problem, right? And actually, as we spoke about before, looking at the data of how many successes there are, it's tough to get it right first time. But having a few more variations gives you that added chance, and most importantly, can really help you to understand and learn from your experiments rather than just that variation one or not. The other thing I quite like to talk about is the wildcard variation. So try to push yourselves to do something a bit different that may lead to something bigger in the future, a bit more explorative, that may be a different angle. But to do all of this, you need to have different ideation methods to give you more ideas and to get people moving on beyond the first idea. And one of the methods that a lot of the work we do these days under the understand area and is our opportunity audits. We have a package of user research, analysis, expert review, and also ideation with the client teams, with different client teams, in a package which we call opportunity audits. And this allows us to generate tons of findings and problem statements, and also a hell of a lot of ABN test ideas. So this is actually real numbers from a recent one we carried out, where we uncovered 105 findings in total just from one of these projects, but led to 61 new ABN test ideas to go into the roadmap and backlog. And a lot of larger things and surprises will come out of this too. It's such a powerful method. But this will allow you to break away from always just doing the obvious, just sticking with the no-brainer as such. And we know where no-brainers take you, don't we? So we really want to encourage everybody to do more discovery research and make sure the teams involved in experimentation are all part of this, and that you try to involve more people in the ideation session from their individual teams, from marketing, from trading, for example, as well as product.
Definitely. And, it can be scary to scale. Being adventurous leads to a lot of risks, and being adventurous at scale with lots of different tests, I think there are some things that are really important to keep in mind when doing so. So the first one would be really selecting the appropriate test and the right goals. So whether that's an A, B, C, D, E, F test, it could be a multi-page test to test out the journey. So if you want to test discount codes across multiple pages, for example, it could be a multi-variation test. You need to, decide what are the KPIs you want to achieve and what type of test is going to get you there. You also want to select the right audience, right? So on one end, you want to see how certain audiences respond to your experiments, but you also want to build your experiments to create a better, more personal experience for your customers. So it's really important to be able to target these experiments and make sure that you're reaching, in this era of personalization and hyper-personalization, that the experiment for that experience is reaching out to the right type of people that you're trying to bring in and convert. Third part, I would say, is when running multiple experiments, so a small amount of multiple experiments, you should always remember one user, one experiment, right? You don't want to be testing a lot of experiments for one user who's going to be, if these experiments aren't consistent either between them, it could be very confusing for a user who's going through a full journey. Speaking of continuity, you also want what we call experience continuity. So that means that whenever your visitor starts or finishes their journey, they're seeing the same variation. And it also means that when they're coming back, if your test is lasting multiple weeks, that they're coming back and they're seeing that same homepage or that same checkout system or whatever it is that you're testing on them. You want them to be able to find themselves easily on your website, right? And for those of you who are really scaling, and I'm talking about use cases and campaigns en masse, what you can do if you don't want to stick to one user, one experience, is that you can bucket your users. So what you want to do is bucket your users into seeing different types of use cases and still helping to avoid overexposure. The last thing, that is very obvious, of course, is that, you don't want to forget to analyze your results. So that's tracking key customer experience metrics, rolling back if needed. But you also want to make sure that you can integrate that data into whatever analytics solutions you use. I think Chris had mentioned it earlier. You can have lots of different solutions and lots of different KPIs, and sometimes they don't match up. So you want to make sure that you're bringing those campaign analytics, you're bringing in which customers saw which variation, so you can build a better unified profile of your customer into whatever analytics solution that you use. So here's a case study on Eurosport. So we talked a little bit about no-brainers, and this one is a little bit of a no-brainer that worked. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't and that this customer didn't experiment, because it's really important, right? And experimentation, can bring great things, right? A small change can lead to a big uplift. So Eurosport, they tested moving their related videos element from below the fold to a sidebar and saw a 162 increase in video clicks. And then if I'm going to move on to the last use case that I want to share, it's really my favorite use case at A/B Tasty, I have to say. And I think it's part of being more adventurous, thinking a little bit outside of the box. And it can lead to wider changes for your organization. Hannah Anderson is a children's clothing retailer. So as you know, children grow quickly. I imagine you've probably seen that at some point in your life. So clothes on a baby look very different than clothes on a toddler, right? So the hypothesis for this experiment is that if a visitor sees an image of the clothing size they've selected on the PLP, they'll be more likely to engage with the product. And this led to a 22% increase in product purchase, which is great. But beyond that, there was a really interesting shift because before they were stocking only a handful of toddler clothing online because it wasn't selling well. So now, after having run this experimentation, this test, they've now decided to offer 100% of their line in these sizes. So 100% of their line, instead of just in store, they're offering it online. And so if you multiply the results, this 20%, by hundreds of products, the revenue impact is significant. I really invite you to check out the use case. It's on the A/B Tasty website. We got to interview them, and they had lots of interesting things to say about how it changed their strategy. But if I can really leave you with one piece of advice after this webinar, it's, don't be afraid, just be prepared. Experiment, take the risk, be adventurous, be creative. I think it's really exciting part of our jobs that, we don't activate enough. So I think we can, I saw that there are some questions that have popped up in the questions pane. Maybe I'll throw it back to you, John, to walk us through those.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Liz and Chris. Really, really fascinating stuff. And there are lots of questions to get through. So I'm going to sort of dive right into them. If I don't go through everybody's, what we'll try and do is kind of write back to you. I have a list of them all, so we'll try and kind of reply to everybody that we don't get through. One of the first questions that did come through, and Chris, you were sort of touching on it a little bit with how you sort of come up with ideas. But someone very early on said, what is the best way to get inspiration for new tests?
Well, I think your customers are the best way to get inspiration at the start for new test ideas. I think it really helps to, it's amazing how many surprises come from user research with real target audience. And it's not just on identifying the immediate problem. but it often identifies like a gap, like they'll be doing something in an unexpected way, because and also they're one of those things where they're very hard to predict as well. We know customers are very hard to predict by the low success rates. When you're face to face with customers, you'll almost always learn something very interesting. And if you include your whole team in that process of user research, it's like the perfect ideation kind of environment for generating new ideas. It's very inspirational.
Okay, fantastic.
And I was going to say that for bigger companies where there are a lot of brands within one big company, so it makes me think of LVMH, Louis Vuitton, that we had on stage at our customer conference on Monday, is that she was talking about how they've now created basically a test list. So any brands that want to start, any smaller maison or houses under the LVMH brand that want to start experimenting, they've already created a basic list of every test that they would do first for those brands. And I think that there's also, sometimes we forget when we're in bigger companies that we can learn from each other, and it's not a competition at the end of the day, right?
Yeah. Oh, and I'm just going to add to that something I mentioned earlier about the ideation technique. So once you've got those kind of customer problems, things like Crazy Eights always work really well, actually. So I don't know if you've done them, Liz, before, but it's a really fun way. So it's the thing we do with a lot of our clients. When we have a customer problem, we in our ideation sessions, we quickly remind everybody what the problem is. So it's based on reality that they're solving, not just randomly coming up with. The worst way to do it is, our problem is we haven't got high enough conversion rate. That's not really a problem. That's just but a lot of people put that in their hypothesis just to improve conversion rate. It's not really what you're doing. It should be more like to look into photography that better resonates with your customers or something like that, or it should be to make it easier for you to do this. That's what should be in the hypothesis. But if you start with that, and then if you do some ideation method like Crazy Eights you need to do in 8 minutes. You need to complete 8 ideas to a problem, just 8 minutes. And you feel under pressure. Everybody will feel under pressure, but it forces people to move beyond their one idea. Otherwise, everyone gets fixated to this. This is the only idea. This is my solution. It's the best, and I can't move onwards. But this forces you to move on. It's a really good method.
Okay, great tip there, Chris. This maybe, well, you can both answer, but we'll start with you, Liz, which is, what is a good pool of data, i.e. the minimum number of users to draw a confident conclusion?
That's a very good question. To be honest, off of the top of my head, I don't remember, and I'm going to throw this to Chris and put him on the spot because I think that he's more likely to implement this regularly with his customers.
Well, you need to put the calculation in, really, and find out what the tricky thing is. As we all know, it's the sample size and it's the minimum detectable effect, isn't it, that kind of give you what that duration should be, what the sample size should be. And it is tricky on low volume websites. It is a bit trickier. I mean, a rule of thumb I used to always use is if we can get around 1,000 conversions per variation or something, that we're going to be all right. We can do experimentation. That's a rule of thumb. But again, it all depends on the effect size as well.
And do you have a sort of an amount of time for how long you'll do an experiment, Chris?
It does depend on the client, but normally it's 2 weeks minimal, and it's almost about the cycle. We want to make sure we have equal weekends, equal weekdays, especially in travel and leisure. But it does sometimes depend on the buying cycle of the business too. There are some occasions where we need to make it a bit longer by minimal, but 2 weeks if we have the data is good, and we feel really comfortable with that.
Okay, fantastic. The next question is, any tips on ensuring the implementation of winning results long-term and sharing best practice? It's kind of a very open question, right? It goes on saying, not results that require development, but for example, structure of copy or image selection for specific audiences. So I think they're perhaps talking about personalization.
That's a good question.
Yeah, because it seems that, I guess, the experimentation, you've decided which version has won, right?
Yeah.
And then it's how do you execute on that now that you've known. So I think a part of that is, looking into, and we didn't talk about it during the webinar, but looking into the results of the experimentation, because you might have a winning test, but is that test winning on mobile or on desktop? Is that winning for your MVP customers? Is it a certain age range? And so you can really deep dive into those experiments and see, are you going to then roll out that feature? And if so, are you going to roll it out to a specific audience? It obviously depends on how complicated the feature is, whether or not it requires development, or whether you can use a WYSIWYG tool, a visual editor. A/B Tasty, for example, offers one that allows marketers to basically add in widgets, pop-ins, and things like that. So winning campaigns, turn their winning campaigns into personalizations and activate them with a JavaScript layer. So it's definitely doable, either with another tool or through development.
Because this is all about, it is personalization, isn't it? Because of the specific audiences.
Yeah.
But it's the permanent application of personalization, isn't it? So therefore it does require, it's often tricky to build in and fully implement on a platform because they don't always have that capability.
Yeah.
So
and I think it's important to remind everyone of the optimization loop where, you could implement something long-term, or you could implement it, and then as customer expectations change, which they naturally will, maybe you'll want to retest that idea. So you want to make a loop where you've tested it, you've seen a winner, and then maybe 6 months or a year later, you might want to throw that back into a test just to confirm that there haven't been any major changes since. Totally.
And I'd add to that, the other advice is make sure you do test your personalization campaigns, because we do come across a lot of situations I've come across where personalization for some reason isn't tested against a control. It's more of again, another assumption that it's going to work. Even for trading and marketing messages, do test, because sometimes it can have an adverse effect.
I'm going to go for the last question. As I said, any ones that we've missed, we will try and reply to. This question is, I hear a lot about server-side testing at the moment. Any tips for getting started with server-side, and what are the benefits?
So if we have server-side, we generally have client-side on the other end, right? And client-side is usually related more to optimization. So client-side tests are usually done by marketers, e-commerce managers. CR specialists can be on both, but they're more, I would say, visual tests that improve, the experience, what you're seeing, how you're interacting with the brand. And they're quick tests that can be put in place really easily and without development resources. And so it's really good for doing small things that actually might lead to big uplift. Server side is obviously when things are getting a little bit more complicated. It's a more innovative change. It requires, server side interactions, usually backend interactions as well. So at least for, in terms of A/B Tasty clients, we've got two types of customers for this. So we've got ones who use our client side and then use server side because they want to do it for mobile testing. And what's really interesting when it comes to mobile testing is that with feature flags, you can actually roll out your tests on a mobile app and run the tests without having to resubmit your app into the App Store. So you can run lots of different tests easily on your app without having to redevelop each time and have to go through that lengthy process of approval. On the other side, we've got customers who are mainly purely app or who are doing big changes. I talked about the checkout before as well. And they're just running experimentations that really have really big impacts on their customers. And so they're making sure that, their developers are very involved, product managers, and marketers as well. Again, back to that shared KPIs and the shared mission as well.
Anything to add to that, Chris?
I mean, we're massively enthusiastic about server-side testing. Yeah. Actually, we do see as a bit of an inevitable future, even if it's a bit tricky. We do a lot of server-side testing. That's actually been one of our main USPs at Creative CX, was that we were kind of the first to embrace it, even if it was difficult, like four or so years ago. But it does give you so much more freedom for experimenting in many more areas throughout the organization, not just being limited to maybe just 10% of all your decisions. And that's a really exciting thing for me about it.
Yeah, I think there's this famous quote about software eating the world. Everything is becoming technological, more and more complex as we go. You need to, we're not just building a website on a CMS anymore. We're really building all of these headless e-commerce sites where really it's a huge investment, right? And it's becoming such a big part of the objectives of brands, especially with COVID. I don't say the C word, but I mean, there's had to be this shift very quickly and this concentration on e-commerce and technology and changes. And with that, you're really moving towards more server-side testing than client-side once you get to that level of complexity.
Well, listen, thank you very much to both of you for taking the time to speak to us today. Thank you to everybody who joined us in the webinar as well. It's really, really appreciated. Obviously, you can check out AB Tasty's website. You can check out our flagship website. You can check out Creative CX's website if you want to see anything. It goes without saying that obviously we also are partners with Creative CX. You will be sending out this replay to everybody who's seen it, and you can come back to us with any other questions or any other information that you'd like to learn. Thank you very much. It was really, really insightful from both of you. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.